back at the top of another year and no shortage of policy issues in the tech and telecom sector. Here to tell us what to expect in 2014 is Kate Tummarello, staff writer at The Hill, and Paul Barbagallo. He's the managing editor at Bloomberg BNA. That's the Bureau of National Affairs. And don't forget to fill out the box just below for the Q&A portion of the show to get your answers live from Paul and Kate. And Paul and Kate, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here. I had the pleasure of watching both of you on the Communicators on C-SPAN not long ago, and I had to have you in our studio to do a little follow-up. So thanks for being here. I want to start with Spectrum. It's on the minds of the industry at large, as you know, Paul. What can we expect in 2014 as far as quote-unquote the Spectrum sale, as you mentioned on the Communicators program, and what can we expect in 2015 for the voluntary incentive auctions?
So the FCC right now is conducting its first auction in 5 years, the H block auction. It's a 10 megahertz block of airwaves. The lone nationwide bidder, if you will, is Dish, and they stand to come away with the full block. Later this year, the FCC will be auctioning off what is known as the AWS-3 band. They have to auction that off according to law by February 2015. And that is a very coveted block of airwaves. It's a 25 megahertz block. It's the 2155 to 2180 band. And CTA, the wireless industry, as you know, has advocated to pair that with the 1755 to 1780 band, which is currently occupied by federal government agencies. But we recently have seen some progress in moving some of the federal agencies off of those airwaves. And so the 1755 to 1780 band will be shared. And so we can see this big swath, 50 megahertz in total, 2525 for commercial mobile wireless services.
So, and Paul, I'm not going to let you go here on this question. Why is one referred to as a sale, quote unquote, and one is an auction? Why is
that? It's a great question. So the FCC for several years had expected companies like Sprint, T-Mobile, perhaps some other nationwide wireless carriers to bid in the H-block auction. Sprint historically had expressed interest. They have airwaves adjacent to the H-block, and so it was a natural fit. Sprint had decided not to participate as a bidder for the H-block. So really the only nationwide bidder, the only big company bidder is Dish, and so the auction is not so much an auction as it is a sale. There are smaller players vying for that spectrum, but Dish is in it to win it.
Now, I know that the magic number for the Spectrum auction is $15 billion. That's expected. The first $7 billion of that $15 billion goes to the public safety network. What happens if broadcasters don't show up or they don't bid high enough to even get to the $7 billion?
Well, it's a problem for Congress, certainly. In passing the Middle Class Tax Act in 2012, they had anticipated that the incentive auctions would earn $15 billion, perhaps more, for the General Treasury, and some of that is already spoken for. $7 billion will go toward FirstNet. So the FCC is under enormous pressure to make sure broadcasters do show up, and they do earn at least enough to support FirstNet.
Kate, I want to move towards net neutrality. It's a touchy subject, depending on where you are on the spectrum or in the industry. There's blocking and price discrimination that's occurring right now, and a recent court decision was a surprise to some of those stakeholders in the industry. Why is that?
I think a lot of people were optimistic, maybe naively, that the court would uphold the net neutrality rules, but the federal court did overturn two critical parts of the net neutrality rules, and now we're waiting to see what FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler does in response. He has a few options. He could reclassify broadband as a more highly regulated service, or he could use the authority laid out by the court to kind of reconstruct the net neutrality rules in a less severe way. I mean, you definitely have advocates on both sides of the issue. Some are even concerned that the court decision gives the FCC too much authority over broadband. So we'll see what the chairman does. He, has to act soon. He is now facing pressure from the Hill. A bunch of Democrats introduced a net neutrality bill this past week. So now he has to deal with that. They clearly want him to act, and he has a few options, and we'll see which one he takes.
And of course, there's contrasting opinions within the FCC on net neutrality, amongst other issues. Wheeler and Pai are two of those folks over there that have those differing opinions on net neutrality. Is Tom Wheeler an idealist that's going to come in and try to flip the paradigm, if you will, and just not really gain any traction?
I mean, he seems pretty pragmatic about this. He's talked about wanting to take a dynamic approach and evaluating things on a case-by-case basis. It's not super clear what exactly he plans to do in terms of evaluating things on a case-by-case basis and, you know, where he's going to go next. But of course, you have the Republicans on the commission who are very happy that the rules were struck down and think this is a step in the right direction. And so you're going to have that tension on the commission between the two parties. But, you know, it's up to Wheeler to see what is most feasible and what's not going to strike up too many fights on the Hill.
Paul, I'm hearing something about the wireline trials. It sounds like some kind of independent movie or something. Of course, we're talking about IP transition and who's adversely affected during that transition. Of course, there's always, and I hate to use this terminology, but collateral damage. We talked in our pre-show discussion about the 5% of the population being affected during this transition. Mm-hmm. Who's in that 5%?
Well, so the FCC took a historic step last week in approving trials to essentially allow the telecom carriers to test the phasing out of their POTS, plain old telephone service, and replacing that with IP-based equivalents. So you're right, 5% of Americans are now wireline only. So no wireless phone, and they rely exclusively on their old landline phone. So as part of these trials, the FCC, the goal for the FCC is to fully understand the impact. Who will be impacted, how they will be impacted. A big question is, whether or not IP-based equivalent phone service, VoIP service. Now remember, VoIP needs a broadband connection, and in many parts of the country, we don't have robust broadband service. Rural areas is one. So that will be a big question for the FCC. But to answer your question, certainly people in rural areas, people who are in lower income areas who rely on traditional telephone service might not be subscribers to wireless service. But it's worth noting that the telecom carriers have stepped up and said, what we're taking away, we're going to replace it with something else. So that might be a home wireless service, that might be a low-cost wireless alternative. But really, nothing has been approved yet. The FCC is basically saying, okay, come to us, propose trials, and we will approve them. And we will see who really is impacted and how they're impacted. So
if I live in a rural area and my copper's, ripped out and fiber's put in, I don't have broadband, is my ability to reach an emergency responder affected by that? If I'm disabled, am I adversely affected as well?
Well, it depends. Certainly, it depends. We have we have the wireline carriers proposing a number of alternatives. We saw on Fire Island, Verizon seeing its infrastructure being completely ripped out by the storm, and they said, we are not going to rebuild copper. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace it with a wireless service. And you saw resistance from local residents saying, we can't fax, we can't do many of the things that we could on our phone service. We touchy service to the PSAPs, public safety answering points. But in these areas, the companies are experimenting with different solutions to ensure that people can connect to their public safety answering point. And that will be a big issue for the FCC. The FCC will not let people around the country lose access to 911 service. That is a big issue for FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, and it will probably be the number one issue throughout the IP transition.
Kate, another big issue on the Hill, as you know, is government surveillance. Of course, we're talking about the NSA. What's the bigger issue, protecting consumers or the information sharing issue between corporations and the government?
I think people are really focused on, how surveillance affects citizens. There were a lot of Snowden leaks that kind of show that the government's doing some things that people didn't necessarily know about, including the lawmakers who signed off on these programs. So a few of those authorities have to be reauthorized in the next 2 years, and members have already said they're not going to reauthorize the programs unless Obama takes steps to scale them back. And he's laid out some of the reforms he plans on implementing, and he's looking to Congress to take up some of the reforms themselves. So we'll see. There's definitely a strong divide. There's the pro-privacy side that wants, the end of bulk collection, including programs that collect information on virtually all American phone calls. But there are hawks in Congress who want the NSA to keep these authorities. They say it helps prevent terrorist attacks, and they don't want to give up that ability.
And you just talked about bulk collection. I want to read one quick quote to you, and if you can add anything to it, let me know. If not, we'll move on, and Paul can jump in here. The House Judiciary Committee must act, said Ranking Member John Conyers. He's a Democrat from Michigan, saying the administration can't act alone. Section 215 is scheduled to sunset on June 1st of 2015. If it expires, all Section 215 programs, not merely bulk collection, expire with it. We should address bulk collection today, or we risk losing all of Section 15 this time next year. Section 215, what are we talking about here?
So that's the authority that allows the NSA to collect a bunch of different things, but it's mostly gotten attention for its phone call data collection. And that's the one that's really become the controversial crux of the surveillance debate. That's what people want reformed, that's what people want scaled back. No one's comfortable having all of their phone call information, no content, just metadata, but no one wants that in the hands of the government, especially for innocent Americans who haven't done anything. But he's right, 215 does authorize other things, and it's, lawmakers are scared that if we let 215 lapse, which people want it to happen because there aren't privacy protections in place, the NSA and other intelligence agencies will lose different abilities that we may not even know about yet to prevent terrorist attacks, which is something that people are definitely paying attention to.
Paul, broadcasters find themselves or think of themselves on the short end of the stick as far as spectrum and voluntary incentive auctions go. Of course, I'm speaking in generalities. But now we have a case called Aereo that broadcasters may find themselves for sure on the short end of the stick. Is Aereo a game changer in our industry?
I think Aereo is the game changer in our industry. I think if there's one event that could bring about a rewrite of our telecommunications and media laws, it's the Aereo case. The Aereo case brings into question everything on the books with regard to broadcasting. Broadcasters under law can ask for a retransmission consent fee from multi-channel video programming distributors, Comcast's, Charter, Time Warner. And Aereo basically retransmits broadcasting signals with dime-sized antennas, thousands of them arrayed in their markets for free over the internet. And so what broadcasters are faced with now is, well, do we continue to broadcast, and how do we continue to broadcast when we have a business model that completely bypasses the retransmission consent regime? Interestingly, for the Supreme Court is now considering this case. It's a copyright case. At its heart, it's a Copyright Act case. But of course, it does bring into question elements of the Communications Act, particularly the '92 Cable Act. The FCC is in an interesting position here as well, because the FCC, if they were to say tomorrow that Aereo is an MVPD, a multi-channel video programming distributor, there might not be any issue whatsoever. Aereo would maybe cease to exist. Certainly Aereo would have to pay the broadcasters. So FCC is another element here. But if the Supreme Court does side with Aereo and say that this is not an infringement of the broadcaster's copyright rights, you could certainly see the broadcasters get organized quickly and call for reform on the Hill.
Kate, is the Aereo case just a natural evolution of our industry, and it's just if you can't beat them, join them type of situation?
It's definitely something that is only possible in the internet age. I think that's something that will play out on the Hill. The House Judiciary Committee is already re-examining copyright law, so this could easily come up there. Congress needs to reauthorize Stella, the satellite law. So that's going to be a big issue, or could play into how that law gets reauthorized. I think we see on the Hill more and more lawmakers paying attention to the ways that the internet is kind of shifting the landscape of traditional media.
Telecommunications Act, Paul, you referred to this just very briefly in your previous answer as far as rewriting the telecommunications laws. If the Telecom Act would go through a rewrite, what would be the first order of business in your opinion?
Well, I think the first order of business for Greg Walden and Fred Upton, who have convened a process to rewrite the Communications Act, is establishing the goal. What are we doing here? Are we tinkering on the edges? Are we adding sections to the act? Are we taking sections away? Are we talking about a structural reform, or are we talking about real statutory reform? We have an act that no longer really makes sense for our modern communications marketplace for consumers. And I think that is certainly a big question for lawmakers. Another big question is you have the Communications Act of 1934 as amended by, most recently, the Cable Act of 92 and the Telecom Act of 96. So are we reforming media law and telecom law at the same time? Are we just focusing on telecom law now and leaving media law for another day? Because I think most people would agree that there's more consensus about modernizing telecommunications law than media law. The fact that you have carriers regulated under Title II of the Communications Act, the Verizons, AT&Ts of the world, and they are not necessarily regulated equally as Comcast Charter with respect to telecom services. So there seems to be more consensus around updating the Telecom Act than the Cable Act. So that is definitely a big question right now, is what do we do and how do we do it? How do we start?
Kate, would you agree that that would be the first order of business? And is there a distinction for, I guess, between telecom and information services as far as, I guess, Title II?
Yeah, definitely a distinction, and that's something that could come up in the Telecom Act rewrite. I think it's important to note that this could take years, and people are expecting this to take a very long time, not something we'll see tomorrow. So between now and 6 years from now, there are a lot of moving parts that could shift and change, including the net neutrality decision. Whatever the FCC does next could greatly impact what the goal of the Telecom Act is. Same with Aereo. If something big happens there, we could see Congress looking at the Telecom Act rewrite as a way to address that. There are a lot of pieces that fit in here, like Paul said, and it'll be interesting to see how where those things stand in a few years when Congress finally gets around to kind of having some specific goal and some specific language.
The last Telecom Act rewrite took 7 years. Former Congressman Rick Boucher and Al Gore, when Al Gore was in the Senate, they introduced the first bill that triggered the Telecom Act rewrite in 96, in 1989. And basically their bill was, let's try to allow the baby bells to provide cable TV service in their local territories, because as part of the breakup of AT&T, the local phone companies could not offer TV service. So that was one small bill that turned into something much bigger, and there was obviously much more in the Telecommunications Act, but it took 7 years to get consensus about the issues, and so yeah.
I want to circle back to cybersecurity and how, I guess, in the midst of the Sochi Olympic Games and the security issues they're dealing with over there, how protected is our federal government? And again, I'm going to start with a quote. The federal agencies remain underprepared to defend their own information systems against most cyber threats. That was said by Republicans on the Senate Homeland Security Committee that was on just this past Tuesday. How do you read into that, Kate? And where are we on cyber on the Hill right now?
Well, there are definitely lawmakers who think that the federal government is not nearly protected enough. House committee just yesterday passed a bill that would encourage the Department of Homeland Security to kind of codify and strengthen its standards, not just for the federal government, but also for critical infrastructure networks, things like the grid and things that people rely on every day and could really bring things down if there were a cyber attack. I think lawmakers are kind of spooked by the recent commercial data breaches. We see that at Target and Neiman Marcus and possibly Michael's, stores that people use every day, and now all of your data is vulnerable if you happen to shop at Target during the data breach. A lawmaker said yesterday, if it's going to happen to Target, when's it going to happen to the critical infrastructure networks? And that's something people are definitely wary of. There's a big concern that one well-placed attack could bring down things a lot of Americans rely on. And that's, I mean, you'll see lawmakers pushing bills. It's unclear where exactly that will go. There is a lot of concern about, the privacy concerns that come along with this. So probably nothing quick, but it's definitely something that's being talked about on the Hill.
Paul, the commercial sector is clearly at risk in the security realm. Is the government just as much at risk?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've already seen federal employees being the targets of cyber attacks. Department of Energy had their employees' personal information compromised by hackers. So, and we've seen Anonymous, the hacking group, just as a test, get in very easily to big government agencies' networks, and so this is a very real issue.
We've actually reached our live Q&A portion of the program, and I'm going to check what we have. We have a couple questions here. They touch on a couple of points that you both made in the last 20 minutes or so. I'll start with Kate. Question number one, how does the latest court decision on net neutrality affect companies like Netflix, and what does the decision mean for consumers?
So the court decision overturning the net neutrality rules definitely has an impact, but it's unclear what exactly that is yet. Netflix said last month in a letter to shareholders, we're not worried about this. We have enough users. If Verizon wants to slow down access to Netflix for Netflix users, they will revolt. They'll find a new service, they'll find a new way to access it. We're big enough that we don't need to worry about this, basically. But what does that mean for the next Netflix? Is there a small company out there right now that could be big in 5 years, but they'll never get there because they don't have the cloud? They can't go up against Verizon, and Verizon could, under the new system, after the court decision, downgrade service to that new video service, and that one never gets off the ground. So in terms of, the average consumer, hopefully you won't see any kind of downgraded service to Netflix. Netflix certainly isn't concerned about it. Google has no reason to be concerned about it. They're all big enough that they can kind of fight this. But, what will it look like 5 years from now? Will small players not be able to get into the market because ISPs decide they don't want to give them access?
Paul, I'm going to go to you on question number two. And again, this touches on something you spoke about before. Doesn't Aereo represent the next generation of communication in the entertainment for broadcasting industry? I guess sort of along the same lines as what I've asked you previously.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at Aereo as the most disruptive technology maybe in the past 10 years in broadcasting. It raises questions on how material programming is disseminated to Americans. Aereo is somewhat fascinating in the sphere of communications, because you have Netflix that streams TV shows, movies. They're not live; they're taped programming. And then you also have the Hulus, which are kind of they get material up faster from the networks, maybe in some cases. You have YouTube, which is another player, and so Aereo is kind of. And I have to give credit to Michael Powell, who said this first in an interview recently. He said, if the Supreme Court allows Aereo to go forward, you could basically create a new multi-channel business model where Aereo provides your broadcast entertainment, Netflix provides your movies, your TV shows, YouTube provides your kind of quick 5-minute videos generated by average Americans. So it does bring into question how broadcasters will continue to exist, and how their signals will be disseminated after Aereo.
I have a question, Paul.
Yeah.
I had a chance to participate and view some not trials, but some meetings down on Capitol Hill, some testimony on Capitol Hill, and it seemed to me that the Congress was challenged in dealing with these new burgeoning tech issues, and they were having challenges with the usual suspects, the same players they've been talking to for the last 15 or 20 years. What's going to happen when these over-the-top folks like Facebook, like Netflix, they show up on Capitol Hill and they have their own new issues, and they're talking to congressmen and women that already feel that the challenge in dealing in this sector? Are they prepared for this wave of issues?
It's a great question, and I think in talking about the Communications Act, I often wondered why do the content providers want to participate? Because they're completely outside of the the reach of the Communications Act and these old laws. So to a certain extent, we've seen the over-the-top players, the content providers, lobby at the edges. We think that this could hurt us. We think that could hurt us. We want this. I think there's a pivot point though when you have these old laws that might not reach the Googles or the Facebooks or the Netflixes, but there are situations in which the law could help them. A perfect example is the Sky Angel case, which the FCC considered. Sky Angel is this internet programming company, a Christian-based internet programming company, and they provide programming over the internet. They wanted access to Discovery Communications channels. Well, Discovery said no, we're not really interested. Sky Angel could not, under the law, force Discovery to basically share its programming. Now, if Sky Angel was an MVPD, according to the FCC's rules implementing the Cable Act, well, Sky Angel could get access, or at least get the FCC to review. But because Sky Angel is not an MVPD, they have no recourse. So you see these issues come up a lot where you have newer players that are largely unregulated and don't want to be regulated until there's an issue where the old laws can help them. So I think you're seeing that there's a duality there on the Hill.
Kate, I'm going to end with you. I want to ask about partisanship on this whole government surveillance issue. First of all, explain to me this partisanship, explain to me the two sides, and how long is this cycle until we solve this problem? Because it's clearly going to have an adverse impact on our industry if we don't solve it quickly.
Yeah, it doesn't even break down necessarily along party lines. You kind of have these strange coalitions building together based on committee jurisdiction. So you see the House Intelligence Committee leader and the Senate Intelligence Committee leader, coming out with a bill that would, they say, improve surveillance programs to kind of protect privacy more. But some say that wouldn't take it nearly far enough. And then you have the Senate Judiciary Chairman Patrick Leahy, who's a Democrat, working with former House Judiciary Chairman Jim Sensenbrenner, who's also a Patriot Act author, working together on their bill, which would curb the NSA's ability to surveil the way it does now. So you have these weird breakdowns where it's not really clear. You can't always guess who's going to play on which team, and everyone wants to do something soon because these programs are sunsetting, and they want to get something done so that the country can continue to protect itself, but in a way that's more meaningful than what's necessarily happening now. And you saw that a lot of the recommendations to President Obama said these programs go too far and they don't do enough. There's no reason to collect all this phone information. It's not really preventing anything from happening, so you should just stop doing it. And Obama has talked about shifting the responsibility of storing that data to the phone companies, which puts the phone companies in a different position. The same way the internet companies are already kind of dealing with the ramifications of these surveillance programs. Nobody's comfortable with the government having it, but that doesn't mean they're comfortable with Google necessarily handing over all the data they have to, or Verizon or whoever. So it'll be interesting to see where this all falls in terms of who holds the responsibility. Is this going to be something that the government, washes their hands of, but then Verizon and AT&T and Google and Facebook have to take on?
It's interesting to talk about, again, all the stakeholders along this sort of value chain, if you will. Everybody's affected by policy decisions. Everyone's affected by the new technologies, and I guess a growing industry where there's so many new players, and it's hard to follow. So it's good to have folks like you in here to talk about it and give our viewers a better assessment of what to look forward to. So it's also good to have you at the top of the year, so we can catch you at the end of the year and find out how things turned out. So thanks again.
Thank you.
All right. And for this segment on demand, please go to tianow.org and stay tuned for all of our Mobile World Congress coverage, also on TIA Now. So long.